Think forward. Think Research Channel.
The following program contains language that may not be suitable for all viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Thank you. I'm Morris Dees, the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Thank you for coming. In addition to the people here today, there's a much larger audience that will be viewing this program on closed-circuit television. Television programs are going to be offered to the students and the community. So the comments you have will be spread to a much larger audience than those here today. But thank you for coming today. After coming from Alabama up here, I can assure you that I'm praying for global warming. May not be politically correct, but that's the way I feel. This white stuff I saw out there was definitely not cotton. When you talk about hate groups in America and how they develop and how they operate, very complex subject, I thought that I might talk with you a few minutes about the hate groups that we do have today in America, and the panelists can comment on various aspects of it, how it affects us culturally, socially, economically, politically, and also in a way that involves most hate groups, and that involves some type violent activity of exclusion or just pure violence. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a project called the Intelligence Project. We track hate groups all over the country. I can't say that we know every one of them. Many of them operate in secret. They don't file their membership list with the Chamber of Commerce. So we have to do a little undercover work, and we have to track them in numerous ways. One of the ways that we track hate groups is through the internet. And we have ways of analyzing the over 600 hate websites on the internet without physically, personally having to do it. We do it with a computer system that we set up that can basically suck the information out, so to speak. At the Poverty Law Center, we have the Google of the hate world, you might say. We can put almost anything in our computer system that was built with cooperation with Cisco systems, and we're able to track and keep up with people as they move from one type of neo-Nazi, white supremacist, homophobic, you name it, group to another. We're just releasing new data about hate groups in America, actually this week. And you can check the website splcenter.org, go to the Intelligence Project, and then you can find hate groups that operate in our total count. As of the numbers I just got before I got here, their total, as we count, in 2006, the year that just passed, there are 842 hate groups. And that's a 5% increase over 2005, and that's about a 35% increase in the last 5 years. There are several things that are spurring on this increase in hate groups, and probably the biggest thing that's across the board that's spurring on hate groups is the increase in activism and acceptance of gay lesbians in America, and the whole issue surrounded with marriage, etc., and partnership arrangements. That's one thing. And the other thing, well, there are several others, but the biggest one, though, bigger than that even, is the issue dealing with immigrants who are coming to this country, primarily from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and south of the border. These are the issues that they're focused on. There are about 10 categories of hate groups, and I'll go over them very briefly, and Michigan is represented in a big way in all these categories. The first is the hate group that nobody thinks about, but it's the biggest hate group operating in America today, and it's a virtual hate group. That is hate on the web. Today, if you were trying to decide how to grow roses in your garden or any other subject you want to, you go on the internet and you find out you don't go to the local garden club. And you might, but you probably wouldn't. You'd find out the subject you want on the internet, narrow it down as to what kind of fertilizer you use, what kind of insecticide you use, you name it, and I'm sure many of you do that with every subject you can imagine. America has grown smaller that way. The same with hate groups. Hate groups today that function in a big way are those that have a web presence. A young person is literally a click away from a hate group. And what happens is these hate groups are set up so they can draw young people in without the young person, and I say young, 12 to 20 years old, without even knowing they're going after a hate group. For example, we just finished the subject of Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday, birthday, and we're involved in Black History Month. And if a young person is assigned in school a topic to look on the internet or just to research and write a paper on Dr. Martin Luther King, most kids today would go to Google, they would put in Dr. King and they'd look it up. And they might find a website that says something like, for the first 5 or 6 paragraphs, Dr. Martin Luther King, leader of his people, etc. And it'd all be very legitimate sounding stuff, which it would be. But then it would digress into areas like, well, Dr. Martin Luther King was a known communist and blah, blah, blah. To learn more about this, click here. So then the young person clicks there and they get sucked into a hate website. And before you know it, they're getting some pretty virulent, nasty stuff. But a young person today, though, for other reasons might get involved, anybody, young or old, and what you'll have is a person in Lansing, Michigan, a young person on the web, and then next thing you know, they're emailing and having a chat room or instant messaging with somebody in Florida, Georgia, California, Oregon. So they've got a virtual hate group where people who have the same likes and dislikes are coming together. They'd never know how to find a skinhead group or neo-Nazi group. Wouldn't go there anyway. It would think they just don't meet. The old day of the Ku Klux Klan group meeting in the back of a country garage in small town Mississippi exists in some ways, but in a very minor way. And then what happens is young people can download from the internet, check some of these websites out like Stormfront, and you can download some of the nasty comments that you see dealing with every aspect of hate in America. And young person who feels maybe insecure, looking for a scapegoat for their own insecurities and failures in life, will decide, hey, look, I need to do something to protect our people, my people, whether they be white people, straight people, you name it, and you end up with them taking some violent action. Timothy McVeigh is the poster child of internet hate. He downloaded from the internet the very recipe for blowing up the Murrah Federal Building with 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer soaked in diesel fuel, driven there in a truck. It comes from the Turner Diaries. It was an online book. You can buy it offline too, but an online book published by a neo-Nazi group out of West Virginia called the National Alliance, headed by a former physicist from Oregon State University. The man's now dead, but Timothy McVeigh has this book, and when he was captured on the back seat of his patrol car, the car he was driving away from Oklahoma City, was stopped by a state trooper, was this passage from this Turner Diaries, a fictional account of a race war, and underlined was how to build the bomb that he used. And that was Exhibit 1 at his trial. So when we talk about how many hate groups there are, and I'll tell you quickly some of these hate groups, keep in mind that in today's modern world of high-tech communications, the biggest hate group is on the web, and it's you might call it the virtual hate group in America. The hate groups that do exist, though, today in terms of that you can go and visit one if you wanted to, and I'll take them in no general order, but one is a group that has about 100,000 members. It's called Radical Traditional Catholics. They're excommunicated priests who been communicated by the Catholic Church, and they operate in 12 big groups in the country. We just did a story on them. You can see it on our internet and our intelligence project. And they have the concept that Jews are evil, that for 2,000 years Jews have been trying to undermine the Catholic Church, and Jews started working with other people, secular people, to have a democracy, and therefore that took away the power of the Catholic Church to control countries, and they also, promote the idea that Jews killed Jesus, and you name it. You know about them because Mel Gibson recently, when he got caught for DUI, went on a tirade against Jewish people. Well, that's no accident. His daddy, his father, Hutton Gibson, is a leader in this group that are also major Holocaust deniers. That's his big thing. So Mel Gibson came about this, in a family way, so to speak. The next group is the Council of Conservative Citizens. It's the old Southern White Citizens Council. we kind of outed one of their people who was supporting them as U.S. Senator Trent Lott. And you may remember he was knocked out of being leader of the Republican Party in the Senate because of disclosures of racial activities. Some of it was because of our bringing forth that he had been talking to these groups. These are, in Michigan, you have a guy named John Reddick from Caledonia, Michigan, who was one of the biggest activists in this new Amendment 2 that came up about affirmative action recently. He was one of the leaders in publicizing this amendment that was passed dealing with affirmative action. These people believe in white separatists, and they believe that blacks, and I'll quote their material, blacks are a retrograde species of humanity, subhuman species of humanity. That's kind of the, so this is the Council of Conservative Citizens. There's 41 of those groups operating in the United States. There's a group called the League of the South. There are 102 groups operating in the country. They're based in Alabama, and they simply want succession. You can check on those groups. They're big Confederate flag flying groups, and they're the ones promoting the Confederate flag in different states. And then the most dangerous and violent group is the skinheads. There are numbers of skinheads. In fact, the Vineland Social Club is a kind of a new skinhead group, and the Hammerskins is another one. But in Detroit, Michigan, the Northern Hammerskins held their annual, what they call Hammerfest in Detroit, which has not been done in this state or outside of Georgia in many years. It's being normally held in Stone Mountain, Georgia. And there are about, as I said, 75, 80 of these groups, and that's up from 50 last year. We're in the process of possibly suing one of these groups real soon for violence against a person they perceived as being Latino. The Ku Klux Klan still remains the largest hate group. There are 164 Klan chapters in the country. I've personally been involved in lawsuits against 4 or 5 major Klan groups, put them out of business, bankrupted and took their property, and now we're zeroing in on the last remaining large hate group for some violence that took place by some of its members. Hopefully we'll be able to get after them. And here in Ironwood, Michigan, there's a chapter of a group called the Brotherhood of the Klan. I guess I said the Klan was the largest, but I really misspoke. The largest hate group in terms of numbers are neo-Nazi groups. There are 192 that we count in the United States. When I say 192, I mean that many different cities and communities have a neo-Nazi hate group. And the 2 major ones are the National Alliance, and that's the group that published the book that Timothy McVeigh used. And they operate out of West Virginia on a 320-acre compound, and they have a hate metal record company that sells about $1 million worth of records over the internet. The other one is a group called the National Socialist Movement, and it's a very violent group. In Cadillac, Michigan, Detroit, Grand Rapids, Port Huron, and one group in northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, operate as National Socialist Movement groups. You can find out who they are on our website. Another group is called Christian Identity. There are about 37 of those. There's one operating in Stevensville, Michigan. And that's a weird group, because the word Christian in this group doesn't mean Christian like Christ, or the Christian church. What it really means is Anglo people, quote, they call themselves white people, who believe that they're the true Jews, they're the true Israelites, that they're God's chosen people, that the people who are now called themselves Jews were really evil, out to destroy God's chosen people. That's crazy stuff. And I'm not saying I in any way describe this, but it is a very violent group. And you may remember a group called the Aryan Nations in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. This was the headquarters of one of the groups called the Christian Identity. Timothy McVeigh also visited several of these groups before he bombed the Oklahoma City building. And their idea is that America's controlled by Jews. They call America ZOG, Z-O-G, the Zionist-occupied government, and they're out to destroy it. They believe that the FBI, headquartered in the Oklahoma Federal Building, after we just had the incident down in I can't think of the town in Texas now, where the people all barricaded in, that the FBI was really responsible for this situation, and so they really blew up the Oklahoma City building, Timothy McVeigh, with the idea of killing the FBI, or agents of ZOG, the Zionist-occupied government. Very dangerous, very violent group of people that are closely watched by the FBI and others. there's another segment of hate groups, the black separatist groups, the Nation of Islam. There are about 88 of these groups in the country, not to be confused with Muslims, not to be confused with the 3.2 million Muslims in the United States that are not involved in any of this activity. But they're, just to quote a few of their leaders, and Minister Farrakhan has been their spokesperson until he's now, I understand, dying of cancer. But their ideas is that they call whites the blue-eyed devils. They say that Judaism is a gutter religion and Jews are children of the devil. And if you read their material, it sounds no different than the neo-Nazi material itself. We've never sued one of these groups because they've never gotten involved in violence in that way. It's more of a philosophy and a teaching than anything else. Those are pretty much the hate groups in this country today. And as I said, the impetus behind them deals with everything that you people find to hate, whether it be people whose sexual orientation is different, economic status, race, gender, religion, and especially, I guess, probably skin color would be the biggest. These groups have been with us in the United States in one form or fashion, not every one of these, for a long time. The Ku Klux Klan being probably the world's longest and largest existing terrorist organization, a domestic one. The FBI and the federal government concentrates on them some, but with our war in Iraq, we're concentrating more on people outside of the United States, which is unfortunate because we're overlooking some of the most dangerous terrorist groups that operate right in the country. Another Oklahoma City could be a moment away, depending on who these groups decide they want to target. Thanks.
Okay. So I have actually written some comments that I'm going to read because I don't have as much experience or I'm not as skilled as Mr. D's here. So, but anyway, so I'll just start. LGBT rights opposition refers to various movements or attitudes which oppose the extension. Oh, and I'm going to focus primarily on LGBT rights. Gabe's laughing at me. I'm going to focus primarily on LGBT issues, so I just wanted to put that out there first in case you think that's what I'm doing. The specific rights that are opposed may include rights to employment, health benefits, social equality, marriage, adoption, and freedom from discrimination on the basis of sexual behavior, sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender identity, or expression. There are fewer movements today of outright public hate and bias towards groups who identify as LGBT. While the KKK and other militia organizations still exist in every state in the United States, public opinion relegates them to the sideline of mainstream culture. But in the battle for equal rights, anti-LGBT groups are vocal, mainstream, and often well-funded. You would recognize these groups today as ex-gay ministries and part of national religious organizations. A new model of identity-based persecution, ex-gay ministries try to convince an individual that their problem of homosexuality or gender expression can be cured and fixed through therapy and prayer. From the late 1970s onwards, conservative Christian organizations such as the Save the Children campaign, Focus on the Family, Concerned Women for America, and the Christian Coalition have built strong lobbying and fundraising organizations to oppose what they called special rights. These organizations tend to align themselves with the Republican Party today and are still alive and well. One of the major public opponents on gay issues today is Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church. If you click the purpose link on his website, it's actually godhatesfags.com, you'll find the following statement. Good evening, gentle friend. Welcome to the Westboro Baptist Church homepage. This page is dedicated to preaching the gospel truth about the soul-damning, nation-destroying notion that it is okay to be gay. God hates fags, though elliptical, is a profound theological statement, which the world needs to hear more than it needs oxygen, water, and bread. We know that hate groups are skilled in spreading inaccurate and hurtful information about target groups. The Westboro Baptist Church has twice visited the University of Michigan campus protesting events held by LGBTQ organizations, labeling the university as fag enablers. The group held signs with pictures of Matthew Shepard reading Matthew in Hell. In their most recent visit in 2005, the church held signs celebrating the death of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, attributing troop deaths to the so-called acceptance of gays by the United States. The tactics that Westboro Baptist Church uses, as the Southern Poverty Law Center and Mr. Deese have often pointed out, are tactics based on dehumanizing, vilifying, and demonizing lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. Another example of an evangelical religion-based hate group initiative is what is known as hell houses. Hell houses, like haunted houses, feature scenes of damnation to its guest, with a scene where Jesus provides eternal life in an exchange or a commitment to resist sin. The National Gay and Lesbian Task Force recently reported that a script for one of these hell houses featured 3 anti-LGBT scenes. In one scene, which takes place in a hospital emergency room, a demon mocks a man on his deathbed saying, "This is Steve. He thought a homosexual lifestyle is all a man could want. Now he is dying from AIDS." We need not only look to exaggerations of hate like this, to the Westboro Baptist Church or hell houses, to see the dehumanizing of minorities that is the signature of hate groups. Most organizations that oppose gay rights today are trying to soften their message, stating that homosexuality is a problem to be overcome, akin to alcoholism, rather than something to be feared or loathed. An example of such softening is an organization that is on the internet called HOME. HOME, heterosexuals organized for a moral environment. This is their mission. HOME is dedicated to the science, logic, and law in explaining why heterosexual activity is right and homosexual activity is wrong. On our website, we have an irrefutable argument as to the immorality of homosexual activity. It should go without saying that we at HOME condemn violence against homosexuals and their supporters. We believe in educating them about the lifestyle, just as we believe smokers, for example, should be educated about their unhealthy lifestyle. It should also go without saying that such education is not a hateful act, as many misguided people would have you believe, which is a little bit to what Mr. Deese was saying in regards to they sort of get you there, but once you start searching a little more, they take you someplace else. In 2007, much of the focus on the opposition to LGBT rights centers around same-sex marriage and adoption. Many states have passed laws to indicate that marriage should only be between a man and a woman. As you know, currently the state of Michigan in 2004 passed a ballot initiative opposing gay marriage. And just a few weeks ago, the Court of Appeals in Michigan ruled that public institutions, such as this one, could not offer domestic partner health benefits to same-sex couples. Much of this sentiment comes from religious organizations and individuals who view homosexuality as a sin, marriage as a sacred union between a man and a woman, and the acceptance of homosexuality in society as a weakening of moral standards. There continue to be examples every day of homophobia and hatred against LGBT people. Most recently, probably most of you saw, Tim Hardaway, who is a recently retired NBA player, just in the past couple of weeks, was quoted as saying, "Well, you know, I hate gay people, so I let it be known. I don't like gay people, and I don't like to be around gay people. I am homophobic, I don't like it. It shouldn't be the world or in the United States, so yeah, I don't like it." What is clear about the opposition to the gay rights movements, and any movement for that matter, is that when we gain momentum in equality and acceptance, the opposition comes out louder and stronger. The reality is that the anti-gay movement is alive and well. It's simply changing forms. We are certainly grateful that the days are over where gays and lesbians are not forced to wear pink triangles in public as a form of identification before they are herded onto trains bound for concentration camps. Today, the love that shall not speak its name is part of the public conversation. But we cannot ignore nor wish away the fact that hate crimes against people who are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender are commonplace. Gwen Araujo, a transsexual woman in 2002 who was killed, Matthew Shepard in 1998 for being gay who was killed, and just yesterday in Detroit where a 72-year-old man was beaten with a pipe as he was walking to his Detroit Windsor apartment because he was perceived to be gay. He is now paralyzed from the neck down. Some may have heard my comments today as isolated incidences, isolated organizations, or as individual acts of bigotry. This could not be farther from the truth. It is all connected, and we shouldn't fool ourselves to believe otherwise. It is true that public opinion has shifted towards increased acceptance of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, less so for those who identify as transgender over the past 30 years. And a resolution was adopted by the American Psychological Association in August 1997 stating that homosexuality is not a mental disorder. According to the Gallup poll, the percentage of U.S. citizens who think that same-sex relations between consenting adults should be legal has increased from 32% to 57% since 1986. In 1977, 56% of U.S. citizens thought that LGBT people should have equal rights in terms of job opportunities. Today, that number has risen to 89%. So I do refuse to give up. We must have hope. Or, as one of our students in our office, Sebastian Colon, always reminds me, that if we give up, then the opposition has won. So I do believe we have made progress. I just keep remembering what my brother told me long ago. He said, "Saucy," that's what he calls me, "they may be winning some battles, but they won't win this war, the war of love, acceptance for all humanity." Thanks.
My name is Floretta King. I was asked to join the panel to offer more of a narrative of the impact of hate, especially coming from an intersectional or multiple identity perspective. So with that, I will say this is my story. I'm not here to represent any particular group, but I want to offer transferable learning in the hopes that we can humanize the impact of hate on individuals and families. I am trying to speak from a multiple identity perspective. And lastly, I'm not interested in reinforcing the notion of the hierarchy of oppression. I believe that, which is the notion that one oppression is worse than the other. But what I want to say is that my story could be easily substituted by the experience of people with disabilities or immigrants or other groups. But what I do hope is that you can recognize in the layering of oppression how hate has had a profound impact on my life. So first I would tell you I identify as a full-figure African-American, middle-class, able-bodied, gender-fluid mother and aunt. I want to offer sort of a social psychological narrative that just gives some impacts. It's easy to focus on the groups and it's easy to focus on their activities, but sometimes we don't see how those activities can create attitudes and actions that impact private circles, particularly families or individuals. So I would start with my parents, who both identify as African American, grew up in the 1950s and 60s. My mother in northern Ohio, and my father in southern Tennessee. My father has very fond memories of family and friends, including white friends in the South, but he definitely has very painful, overt or memories of overt racism in Tennessee, which caused him to relocate to the north. My mother tells a story of observing and also experiencing covert and overt racism in the South. And then she also acknowledges, as a light-skinned African-American, she saw the difference in treatment even among African-Americans, light-skinned and dark-skinned blacks. And she has very profound memories of how the racial tension in her school changed as the activities of the 60s impacted the school, and how whites and blacks started to look at each other very differently. Their experiences obviously informed how they raised us, and my twin sister and I, as children. There are two strong themes, as I remember growing up, is that they wanted us to act perfect, especially in public spaces, because of the fear of being reprimanded by white people in public space, and then second, how much education was to be stressed and how school was to be taken seriously. And I, regretfully say that these were very much reinforced in their own sense of violence. And part of that is because when they saw other people reprimand or intervene on bad behavior from children or even adults, there were times that they saw it and so violently reinforced that they weren't sure if those around them would live to even tell the story. And also just how they handled their own stress of dealing with the dailiness of hatred and oppression in their lives. So I'm going to move forward and talk about, just highlight some of my own experiences around dealing with hate and oppression. From a young child, I remember specifically teachers including or talking about how, and specifically targeting Black children, that they would not succeed, that they were not capable of doing anything but manual labor and service work that was not seen as high priority. I've also had experiences where I was called nigger and so forth, and there was nothing done to reprimand those people who were involved in those incidents. And even as an adult, the fear of threat is constant. Even as I am a consultant and diversity trainer for diversity education and social justice, I've had the experience of the virtual hate. If you Google me and can dig me up from the, I'm not that important, but if you will find a couple of articles of people targeting me because of that work. And I can talk, I'm not going to explain every experience, but there were a couple that were pretty impactful. At some time in college, I was traveling to do door-to-door sales with the books company. I don't know, you guys probably have experienced those. We had a car breakdown. A person came to help us out. I was the only African-American person of color in the group. And the man was willing to help us out, but he gave us a hard time, and he took us to this very secluded area, and he looked at me and the other white woman, and there was 2 white guys with us, and they were like, well, who's going to take the nigger bitch, to go have sex with her, and then who's going to the white woman? It was really profound. And I really did not know if I was going to come out of that situation alive. Another encounter that I won't speak of actually any more specific encounters, but I will say that I've had a number of incidents that have targeted many of my identities in regards to hate, and it does shape and inform how I pursue my work, and now, as I'll move into the next part, as to how I raise a family. I have found my life partner, who happens to be a biracial, multiracial woman, and her story is interesting in the fact that, and this is how, again, hate interferes, is that she was born to a white woman and a Black man, and asked the Black head nurse of the hospital would she take the child home to raise her, because she could not take a Black child home to her family or her community. And the head nurse did do so and raised her in a predominantly African American community. But as a woman who realized her attraction towards both men and women, she did not feel comfortable pursuing women whatsoever, as she grew up in Tennessee and Georgia herself. But I don't think that's specific to the South. I think it's how attitudes and behaviors are demonstrated versus the location. She did, in fact, marry and have 2 children. And at this point, we are raising the 10-year-old who is a medium dark girl, and her other daughter lives with her husband, which we do see as often as possible. And then I am very connected to 2 nieces and a nephew in Toledo, Ohio. And the raising of children in this society at this time, hate does inform how I do approach them. And I try not to do what my parents did as far as being violently reinforcing expectations of them or having or making them feel they have to be perfect children because, you know, if a black child or a white child does something in public, the same activity, which really isn't bad, the black child will have, it is seen that they are reinforcing these magnificent negative stereotypes, whereas the white child is just being a silly old little child. And I try to keep that in mind as I am raising them. And now with the passing of the anti-affirmative action ban, because we really thought we were coming to a safe haven, coming to the University of Michigan, with the passing of the anti-affirmative action ban, the anti-domestic partner benefits legislation, and really, truthfully, the economy in Michigan, I do feel nervous again about raising my family and keeping my family safe. We have to look through multiple lenses. Even now, as we try to search for a place of worship, it's been very difficult. We can find it if it's gay-friendly, but then the racial dynamics are of a concern. We can find it where there's racial dynamics are great, but then we're concerned about being accepted as a same-sex family. So I just want to offer just a few words. I could talk more, I can give more examples, but I think as we talk about how hate groups are organized and how they're being organized on so many different levels and how they have different looks about them, we do need to see how each of us may be reinforcing the very philosophies that they're organizing around. I do remember people being very, very upset about the anti-affirmative action, as I was. But when the domestic partner benefit stuff went through, it was like an earthquake to me, and I did not see that same response. So for me, there's different reactions to different issues, and I'm sure that there are also issues out there that I haven't or I'm not conscious of that are happening at this very moment. And when I talk to students or teach them about social movements, I talk about how people may not always have the understanding of all the social movements going on at the time, and some are even oblivious to the social movements that are impacting them directly. We do need to make an effort to do that, and we do need to make a profound effort to counter the hate movement. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I wanted to start actually by just saying how honored I am to be on this panel and with these activists whose work is so important in confronting and challenging the strain of hatred that we find in our culture and in our politics. My role is a little bit different. I'm an historian of African American social movements, and I want to do is say a little bit about, sort of contextualize a little bit of our conversation in the history of organized hate and hate violence in American history. And the tale I want to tell is both celebratory and cautionary. Celebratory in the sense that if we look back sort of historically over the past century and a half, what we see, in fact, is a tremendous victory, a tremendous success in the pushing of hatred, the politics of hatred to the margins, or at least from the center, maybe not all the way to the margins of American politics. And we ought to honor and celebrate those changes and the changes that some of the panels have discussed. But cautionary, of course, because that's not a one-time victory. It's not something that's just achieved once and then it's solved, right? That there's a constant, and I think what's been wonderful about the panel is that reminder of the presence of hatred and its threat not only to families, to individuals, the threat of violence, the stories that, everyday stories of violence, which are of course should be of tremendous concern to us, but also of the political potential of that violence and that hatred, and the need to be ever vigilant, perhaps, but certainly ever aware of the need to struggle against those kinds of violence. If we look at American history, what we see historically is that organized hate has developed and has long been an instrument of political and economic power, a defense of political and economic power, beginning obviously with the Ku Klux Klan and its use of racist violence against the Reconstruction state governments in the post-Civil War South, And not only in the actual violence of the Klan, but also in the narrative, the stories it told and its defenders told, in which white supremacy becomes the essential defense of the nation. And I'm thinking here, of course, of D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation, and the novel by called The Klansman by Thomas Dixon, that it's based on, right, which tell stories of an American nation, not just of a Southern nation, in which white supremacy and race and white violence against blacks are essential to save the nation, and which becomes a kind of founding story of American politics. A story so powerful, right, that Woodrow Wilson, while in the White House, described, not only showed The Birth of a Nation in the White House, and he did a little blurb, right? Film critic, so here's the president as film critic, and his little blurb describing The Birth of a Nation as history written in lightning, and honoring that story of defense of the nation. And I won't go through sort of all the examples we could come up with, but here we see through the era of lynching all the different ways in which lynching, while presenting itself as defense of white virtue, of white womanhood, right, was really about defending white political and economic power in the South and keeping African Americans safely in their place, and particularly in the agricultural labor force. And here we, obviously the work of Ida B. Wells in demonstrating that fact was crucially important to the struggle against lynching. But what we see throughout the period of the early 20th century is the ways in which lynching is used to maintain what one social theorist has described as a tripartite system of racial domination in the South. Of course, at the same time, we should never think of lynching and hate groups as solely Southern phenomenon by any means. The KKK, of course, was really from the very beginning a national organization, the dominant political force, for example, in the 20s and 30s in not only the state of Indiana, but in western Michigan as well, with a nativist message that demonized not only blacks, but Catholics and Jews. And particularly the rise of pro-Nazi movements in the Depression era is a story both of real threat to the nation, and the story of the resistance against it is an important story in understanding the origins of the civil rights movement. As neo-Nazi forces rose up in places like Pennsylvania and other places, activists came together, activists from African American community, from the Jewish community, from the Catholic community, from mainstream Protestant churches, to really organize against and to challenge these forces, and particularly the ways in which they sought to use the politics of the Depression. And I think this is relevant for our thinking about Michigan today. The politics, the moment of economic decline, as a time in which hatred really, as a kind of context in which hatred really feeds, and the need to respond to it and to challenge it. And my own work is on civil rights and black power in Philadelphia, and one of the things we see there is that the movements to defend civil rights and racial equality really find their origins in that need to stand up against that kind of politics of hate. If we look then, and finally, but to say again that of course there's other forms of hatred that have had political power, economic power in the North, and obviously one of the places we see sort of ongoing racist violence in the post-World War II period in the North is in efforts to defend all white neighborhoods. While not of the same order of kind of Klan violence or lynching, it's a very powerful kind of violence that really does shape the American landscape in the post-war II to this day. When you look at the landscape of metropolitan Detroit, the racial demographic landscape, part of the way that's shaped is by the patterns of violence that were used to defend all white neighborhoods against desegregation. The process of pushing organized hate to the margins, is clearly one that was born out of the civil rights movement, and it's a product of activist, hard work, political work. The Southern Poverty Law Center and Mr. Deese's work is obviously a crucial part of that, and one that, as I say, we should celebrate. But we also have to, of course, remind ourselves that as the stories of the rise of anti-gay organizing, as the rise of the Minutemen and the attacks on immigrants, undocumented immigrants, as the numerous stories of anti-Muslim and anti-Arab violence and post-9/11 remind us. The hate exists, obviously, it's threatening, but it also has a political potential that we must keep our eyes on, whether it's in the work of David Duke and those who would take advantage of Proposition 2, of economic decline in Michigan. I think one of the things we need to be watching is that there's obviously in part of what's the message of Proposition 2 is that suddenly all these white people are going to get into Michigan who didn't get into it before. That's, of course, that's not going to happen. We know that's not going to change that much. Even if the university went to just SATs or whatever admissions process that these people imagine would make a big difference. And so what are the politics of the kind of resentment that that's going to produce? And just close with one story about the political potential of hate. As you probably saw this past week, the University of Illinois, after a prolonged, long struggle, finally agreed to get rid of its Indian mascot. We had a colleague here speaking last week, Professor David Roediger, talking about the struggle there. And one of the things stories he told was of an effort using the web here to resist this, an attempt to defend the mascot, in which a group of white students posted on the web a kind of petition in which they promised to become racists if the chief was gotten rid of. And so that, again, that power of a kind of racist politics as a kind of tool against social change is something that we clearly need to pay attention to at all times. Thanks.
Sure, I'm the moderator, but if you'd like to, I think we'd open up the floor for questions. And if you direct your question to a panelist, and we'll attempt to answer it.
I'm a student at the University of Michigan, and I actually had a question for Mr. Dees about your classification of the Nation of Islam as a hate group. My question is basically kind of what makes the Southern Poverty Law Center designate the Nation of Islam as a hate group, because when I think of a hate group, I think of a group that actively seeks to oppress another or cause harm to another group, whereas from my experience with the Nation of Islam, their main focus is the upliftment and eventual success of the African American race in the United States.
Well, a lot of the groups that are listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as hate groups are also listed by the Anti-Defamation League and the Wiesenthal Center and other groups, not just our group. We didn't choose to list this group as a hate group alone. And we're not talking about Muslims in general as America, as I said. We're talking about a group who stated philosophy and stated comments condemning other ethnic and racial groups parallels those of other hate groups. Most of the hate groups that we list don't cause violence to other people. The League of the South, the Council of Conservative Citizens, a number of these groups don't promote violence. They promote separatism. They promote demeaning African Americans or people who are gays and lesbians, transgender, bisexual people. And if you simply just look at the language that the published material of Minister Farrakhan's group, you'll see those identical type statements, and that's the extent of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Willie Parker. I'm on the faculty in the Department of OBGYN at the medical school, and I'd like to thank you all for a very excellent presentation. I have a question for you, Mr. Dees, and for the leadership of the LGBTA as well. First with you, Mr. Dees, with regard to the Southern Poverty Law Center's core identity of addressing hate, the core identity is related to race-related hate crimes. But as you now break down the walls between the different isms and recognize the interaction between hate crimes, whether it be against gender orientation or race, have you found, particularly from African American groups where we have, in my opinion, a higher level of homophobism, as you venture into issues that relate to gender identity, that there's been some resistance of people to identify their issues with those of hate crimes against same-sex oriented people?
That's a good question, Mr. Parker. The only way that would come in context with us is because we have a national program called Teaching Tolerance and Acceptance. It's now used in 80,000 schools in America and it's basically a program that involves a magazine that goes to 600,000 teachers, as well as teaching materials, kits, and a lot of the material deals with homophobia, and it's aimed at K through 12. We haven't seen any resistance to this material because we don't go ask the Cincinnati school system to adopt the program. It goes directly to teachers. We've seen little or no resistance to a large percentage of our material that is in that direction. The director of this group, Jennifer Holliday, is a lesbian woman who's married to an African-American lesbian woman, and so she's constantly promoting this material and the material that we send out. We just haven't seen it. But let me say this, the Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't just fight violence aimed at African-Americans. We've been dealing with issues of the kind that you're talking about for a number of years. But you might have a better view of whether African-Americans resist this gay-lesbian issue more than non-African-Americans. I don't know.
Are you asking me that same question?
It's a part of the question that I will ask you all. First of all, I want to, I guess, out myself in terms of standing in solidarity with LGBT people as a heterosexual man, because I understand that the issue really isn't what my sexual orientation is. I'm vulnerable to homophobism if someone just thinks that I'm gay. That invites the same level of violence against me as it does if I were gay. So as a straight man, I stand in solidarity with you. The question that I have for you is, the leadership there represents the racial diversity with regard to black and white, with regard to same-sex relationships. And historically, when it came to feminism, part of the distrust or mistrust in the feminist movement initially was black feminists, black women who identified themselves as feminists, had to kind of decide whether they want to stand in solidarity with white women, because white women, feminists, had to decide whether or not they were going to, where they were going to come down on the issue of race. Part of the issue has been that maybe to the liking of some black feminists, white feminists haven't come as clean on that issue as they ought to. My question to you, in terms of the issue of gender identity or LGBTA, have you all been able to address that issue in a meaningful way? Because I look at the two of you, if we assume, as you put on the different filters, as if you are poor and you're black and you're lesbian and you're a woman, you have 4 strikes. If you are middle class and you're black and lesbian and a woman, you have 3 strikes. If you're white, it's the same level. So one of you has 2 strikes, if I'm assuming that you're middle class, and one of you has 3. Have you all been able to meaningfully bridge that gap across race? Because sometimes black women feminists don't see their issues as the same as white women feminists. And I'm asking if that same dichotomy sometimes exists in the same-sex community. Thank you for your response.
That's a whole nother paper. Well, I really appreciate you being in solidarity with us. That means a tremendous amount. And it is something that we talk about in the office all the time. I'm not a believer that homophobia in the African American community is at a higher rate than it is in other communities. I think in cultural communication studies, what you'll find is that some cultures have a tendency to be more vocal than others. That's the only thing that I think is happening. But I don't really believe that when you look at numbers that, people of color communities are 100 times more likely than white communities to be homophobic. What I do think is happening, particularly as it relates to coming together around multiple identities, is, well, first of all, from our office, we're not engaged with other issues of social justice based on whether other people appreciate and support our cause. So regardless of whether people of color think LGBT issues are legitimate or need to be appreciated or accepted, doesn't really have anything to do in our office about whether we're going to be out there on the streets advocating or how we were advocating that the Proposition 2 not pass. And of course, I didn't do that as a staff member. I did that as a community member because it was illegal for me to do as a staff member. But nonetheless, one thing for us doesn't have anything to do with the other. We're still going to be there in solidarity. But I do think that there are issues. And I do think the idea of, we talk about in our office this notion of hierarchy of oppression or oppression Olympics, and, you know, how we come together when there are individuals who think they have 2 strikes or 3 strikes or 4 strikes, and it's complicated. And what I do think is important is that we need to continue to be in communication with each other, and we really need to build coalitions. That I really find that once we start to have conversations with each other, we really find ways, I mean, all of what you heard from everybody is that there's a group of people out there with a plan, and so we need to come together and be in opposition to that plan, because it's easy to divide and conquer, and I think that's what a lot of white supremacy groups are doing. But
I do want to add a couple of things to the first question. Is that the very parents who tried to prepare me to deal with racism, they're really struggling with homophobia and heterosexism. They are, I think, the most, they have the strongest impact on me right now as far as not supporting my relationship with, but, you know, life must go on. So I meant to say that in my story. And I do appreciate what Jackie has said, because I think that sometimes the Black community gets more marked for being more homophobic. And I think the focus just needs to be, how can we address homophobia and heterosexism across all racial barriers? And then the answer to your second, or just to add to what Jackie said, I do want to point out that our staff is a very diverse staff. We actually have 2 of them here, one who identifies as a Filipino gay male and another as a Puerto Rican, fluid, gender fluid, sexual orientation fluid male. So I do want to acknowledge that, and that we are very clear that we have to fight against the institutional perception that we are just a very white run office. And so we have constant communications or discussions around that. And then the other piece that I can bring from my time as an activist and an educator in Chicago, the issues around race was huge in the LGBT community. I mean, huge. And it was unfortunate because there were so many amazing groups there that are doing some great work. But there was definitely some resistance with white LGBT organizers being inclusive of LGBT of color communities. And, you know, just like the feminist movement, there are certain issues that are more profound in those communities that are not seen as priority in the white LGBT community. So, you know, I was a part of a group called Affinity that was excellent at saying we would like to be a part of these efforts, but you need to also come with us as partners, as real partners, or be a part of what we're doing as well. So.
Hi, my name's Kelly Flint. I'm an attorney in the Student Legal Services Office, and I first wanted to, I actually came here today to extend a thank you to Mr. Dees, because I relocated here in early 2003 from Connecticut. I have three of my children are biracial, and the town that we relocated to, there were some transitional issues with that for one of my kids, and in response to what he experienced, I went online to the Southern Poverty Law Center, tolerance.org, got a lot of your materials, took them to a couple of school board meetings in my town, and I think that did contribute a great deal to resolving some of the issues. And since then, the schools have participated in Mix It Up Day, and I've seen some of the tolerance materials in the counseling office, so I think it does make a tremendous difference. But my question was, as far as hate groups, which is kind of another reason I came here today, was to hear what the status was. What more can we in our communities do? We become aware of them, and I know there's litigation efforts to try and at least control the violence, but is there more? Are there suggestions from the panel as to what the communities can do to deal with the issue?
Just as a first comment, we have a publication called 10 Ways to Fight Hate, and it's available on the web as well as you can get it to distribute. And it deals with if a hate group's in a community, what do you do with it? And it's more than I could say specifically here about now without taking too much time. But there are definitely things people in the community can do, especially if a hate group like comes to campus, like a Fred Phelps group. When I say hate groups, I didn't mention Fred Phelps. He's a highly homophobic group. We list that as a kind of the other category. It doesn't fall in any specific thing. And there are many things you can do. And one thing, just quickly, you don't do is you don't go out and confront them and demonstrate in their face. That usually gives them more publicity than you get. And we've seen this happen all over America. You have a community-wide approach to saying we're not like them, we're not part of them, and we're promoting tolerance, love, acceptance, etc. And you usually get a lot of people involved in the community, from the leaders of the community politically, religious-wise and all, and hold your comments and demonstrations before this group even speaks. And hopefully you don't go out and give them any recognition. That's sometimes hard to do when you have a Klan group or a neo-Nazi group showing up, because there are those among us sometimes who don't believe they have a right to demonstrate. And consequently, that the police have to protect those Klan or neo-Nazi groups from violence from those who are trying to protest that they're not should be there, and that's the wrong way to go about it. Some people might disagree, but on the First Amendment, in America you have the right to hate, but you don't have the right to cross that line and hurt people. It's a fine line, but it's a line that makes this nation different than other nations in the world.
Hello. Hi, my name is Gabe Javier, and I actually work in the Office of LGBT Affairs, and I had a question for Mr. Dees. I'm wondering if you can comment briefly on hate crime legislation and its effectiveness, whether you believe it to be truly an effective deterrent for perpetrators, or do you feel like it's more of a symbolic sort of action done by legislators to make a stance against hate?
It can be effective and it can be symbolic. Let me give you an example. When James Byrd was dragged to his death behind a pickup truck down in Texas by a couple of Klan types, hate crime legislation wouldn't have helped anything in probably preventing it, or especially in prosecuting it, because one of them got the death penalty, the other one got life in prison without parole. It was simply murder, and murder is, you don't have to heighten that. On the other hand, hate crime legislation is a community speaking out, saying that we want to enhance punishment because what this person did goes against the mores of the community. So this is something we want to do. Some people think that hate crime legislation violates the First Amendment. You commit a crime, and why you committed it all be irrelevant. But that's not the way we approach crime in general. If you rob a bank, let's say, or let's just make it more simple. Let's say you go into a 7-Eleven store or Easy Curb store, and you have a stick in your hand and you demand money, and you get the money. In most states, that's robbery, and you would get a sentence. But if you had a handgun or some type of weapon, you would get a mandatory 5 years added to your sentence. Well, it's still just robbery, but society wants to stop crime being committed with guns because guns tend to kill people. So we have an enhanced punishment. If a person moves into a neighborhood, and the first speaker, one of the questioners said that she moved in this neighborhood with biracial children, and that caused a problem. Let's say somebody put a note on her car that said, with some slur, that we don't want you in this neighborhood, and let's say they slashed her car tires, and they were arrested. If they had merely slashed the car tires, it would have been a crime of malicious destruction of property. And that, let's say, is a misdemeanor, maybe carrying 6 months in jail. But by putting the note or making people know that they didn't want her there because of her race or mixed gender, mixed or whatever, mixed ethnic background, children, whatever, then that's different. And that makes it a hate crime, and that might enhance the punishment to a felony, because her deciding where she lives is an important thing. And if somebody doesn't want her there because of her racial ethnicity or whatever, gender, you name it, then that's a serious issue. But it's just some mean-spirited person walking down the street, you know, just dragging a nail or something along the side of cars, scratching them all up, I mean, and done for nothing for just meanness, that's not a hate crime. That's just a crime. So I favor hate crimes legislation and always have. Most of it should be on the state, not the national basis, because you don't want to take federal laws and make state crimes federal crimes. You would bog up the system forever. Most states, we find, particularly in the South, are very interested these days in prosecuting people for hate crimes. I mean, they just line up to do it. We've seen this all over the South. It may not be as prevalent in other areas, but I know we've seen it there because we've been able to bring prosecutions against some of the people who committed acts back in the days of the civil rights movement, and prosecution after prosecution has been successful, as well as hate crimes in general.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian. My question is about economics.
Could you speak up a little?
Sorry, my question is about economics. And as we are, from day to day, we are primarily consuming or economic agents. And that is where a lot of our latent power lies. And I'm curious about what studies are being undertaken or what you guys know about using that power to combat some of these groups that are well-funded, as you said.
So your question specifically is about economics?
Well, it's about how can we use our power, which we have just by spending our dollars to fight these things. Aside from not donating to these groups, of course, but how what kind of connections do they have that we can exploit economically?
Okay. Just quickly. And if anybody else wants to add anything on these comments, please do. I don't want to dominate the questions here. But on that question specifically, most of these groups don't have any economic power. They have no wealth or money. We've taken a few groups to court. We've taken away some of them's headquarters, and they're small dollars, small potatoes. What they have is an enormous passion for their work. And that makes up for the difference in economics. I don't know of any way that you can go after them economically. They're not nonprofit, tax-exempt groups. They don't even purport to be. So you can't really get them from that standpoint. But from an economic standpoint, just economics in general, since you bring that up, that's the biggest divide in America that separates people, as most of you know. It's along economic lines, those that have political power and economic power and those that don't. And a lot of the problems in our country today, especially with immigrants, documented and undocumented in this country, deals with the NAFTA and the trade agreements that have really affected in a negative way the economic conditions of countries south of the border, Mexico, Guatemala, and Salvador, basically strangling communities because they're able to get products in from America, agricultural especially, at such a dirt cheap price. Corn from Iowa, where you can grow 200 bushels an acre, being sold for almost nothing in a Mexican rural village that can grow 10 bushels an acre. So you can see people are not going to be growing corn. So you have farmers that have nothing to do, and people are starving, and that's why they're coming to the United States. That's an economic issue that we can deal with that underlies the whole issue of trying to attack a hate group on an economic basis. We can get our foreign policy in such a way that people are not fleeing their own country because of our issues here politically. Yes, ma'am. We have about time for a couple more questions. Yes.
Okay. Hi. My name is Samara Wycliffe, and I'm an advocate at the Sexual Assault Prevention Awareness Center on campus. My question is something I've just kind of been wrestling around in my mind while hearing all of you present, was about violence against women, and what do you all think about women as being targeted and how it's not classified as a hate crime, but it's clearly a devaluing of women and young girls? What do you all think about that?
Why don't you answer that, because I didn't hear. Would you answer that, please?
Well, I mean, I think you're right that violence against women is a hate crime. I think part of what we were talking about here today was in the context of groups. And although when when you look at many of these groups, I mean, they're filled with sexism and domestic violence and violence, violence against women. That's for sure. So, in some way, you bring up a good point in that that discussion is probably somewhat invisible, and that it probably is important to make it more visible. So.
I think especially with the issues around sex trafficking, it really highlights that situation, and also how rape is used as a tool of terrorism everywhere around the world. So I definitely believe that that the misogyny, the violence towards women should be classified. The politics around that obviously has made that very, very difficult. So.
Thank you very much for your comments. To the panelists, one more question. I'm sorry, I didn't see you at the microphone. I'm very sorry.
I was also curious about the international structure of hate crime, and if you guys, I know you're national, but I don't know if you've looked into any of those things. Like, I know there are neo-Nazis in Europe, and there's a lot of hate around the world, so I'm wondering what you know about the substructure internationally.
Well, the Southern Poverty Law Center has sponsored some conferences dealing with people in Germany, France, England, and several other countries. We've hosted 2 of those conferences, bringing people together, and we've attended some in Europe also. There is a rise of primarily neo-Nazi skinhead activity in France, especially, and in former East Germany, and as well as in other countries. It's a serious issue. It's not one that we focus on in terms of exposing or doing anything about, other than we find that in most of those countries, their laws do not even allow neo-Nazi material or hate material to be distributed. It's a crime. Even Canada, it's a crime in Canada. They don't have the First Amendment like the United States does. So consequently, most of the material that's distributed and used in these countries comes from the United States. And with the World Wide Web like it is today, they can't emanate from those countries because it'd be a crime, but they can pick it up from the United States rather easily.
One of the things that I'll just mention as it relates to specifically to international issues and the LGBT population is that what gets complicated in that conversation is, depending on what part of the world you're talking about internationally, really depends on the acceptance, the legislation, and the amount of homophobia and discrimination that's happening against LGBT people. And so in many ways, around that particular area, you do really need to look country by country. I mean, when you look at Western Europe these days, at least politically, there's lots of legislation that's being passed who approve same-sex marriage. Spain, France have, or civil unions, depending on what you call it. Denmark, a lot of the northern European countries. I mean, even if you look at Iran, what's interesting about that country is that, on the one hand, they don't accept gay, lesbian, bisexual identification, but they do accept transgender identification, and they actually provide health benefits for people to be able, nationally and through their government, to be able to provide health benefits to individuals so that they can transition. And so, again, it just gets really complicated. And again, I think you just, in many ways, need to look at country by country to really determine that.
We have one more question, and this is the final question.
Okay, you were mentioning the 10 specific, the greatest hate groups, and I just want to know if you could list those.
Pardon me, what was your question again?
You said there are 10 main or specific hate groups, and you said the biggest one being the virtual hate group, and I just wanted to know if you could list the other 9, or if you have that information, or.
Well, you can look on the website, splcenter.org, okay. And you can see the categories of hate groups that we list, but and I think that might be the best way to get them, the Klan, the skinheads, the neo-Nazis, and among the major hate groups in the country.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that concludes our panel discussion. I wanted to thank you all again for coming out to support us in our endeavor, again, to educate and empower in our Diverse Democracy Lecture Series, and have a good afternoon.